The wind howled across the moors that night, carrying with it the scent of rain and despair. Inside the crumbling manor of Winthorne Hall, the candle flames flickered as though they, too, feared what was being decided within those walls. Clara Winthorne stood in the shadow of the stairwell, her hands clasped around the locket her mother had given her before she died. A locket that was the only beautiful thing she owned. Beyond the parlour doors, her father's voice rose, sharp and desperate, haggling away the last remnants of his pride. "She will be well taken care of," came the voice of a stranger, deep, measured, foreign. "My terms are generous. You'll have your debts cleared within a fortnight." Clara's heart clenched. She did not need to see the ink dry to know her fate was sealed. For months now, whispers of ruin had haunted their estate. Unpaid taxes, gambling losses, unpaid servants who had long since fled. Her father, once a respected nobleman, had become a man hollowed by failure. She had hoped foolishly that he would rather face ruin than barter her future. But the rustle of parchment and the scrape of a quill told her otherwise. When the door opened, her father emerged, a man broken not by sorrow but by shame he refused to show. "Clara," he said, voice uneven, "you will marry Lord Alaric. He has offered salvation for both of us." She looked past him. The stranger stepped forward. He was tall, dressed in a dark travelling coat dusted with rain. A scar crossed the side of his jaw. Faint but old, his eyes were not cruel but unreadable, like the sea in winter. "Your father speaks truly," the man said. "I offer my name, my home, and protection. In exchange, I ask only that you come with me without question." Her lips trembled. "And if I refuse?" The man's gaze softened, though his tone did not. "Then your father's debts will consume this house, and you along with it." It was not said as a threat, but as a truth carved from pain. She felt her breath leave her chest. Somewhere inside, the small, proud part of her wanted to scream, but another part, the part that had learned from years of loneliness, simply lowered her eyes and nodded. "Very well," she whispered. "When do we leave?" "At dawn," he said. The hours that followed were a blur. Servants she barely knew packed her meagre belongings, a few dresses, her mother's Bible, and a folded scrap of music, the lullaby she had once sung by the firelight as a child. Her father avoided her eyes, drowning his guilt in another glass of brandy. When she went to him before leaving, he only muttered, "You'll thank me one day." But even he did not sound convinced. As dawn broke over the bleak horizon, the sound of carriage wheels shattered the stillness. A black carriage stood waiting at the gates, its crest unmarked. No family sigil, no title. Just darkness and promise. Lord Alaric stood beside it, his coat collar raised against the wind. He did not offer his hand as she approached, but when he saw the tremor in hers, he nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, not command. "Do you fear me?" he asked quietly as she hesitated before stepping inside. "I fear everything," she said simply. His expression flickered, the faintest shadow of empathy, before hardening again. "Then you are wiser than most." The carriage door closed with a heavy thud, sealing her fate. Through the frosted glass, she watched Winthorne Hall recede into the distance, its chimneys collapsing, its windows dark, the only home she had ever known fading into mist. The road stretched endlessly before them, lined with skeletal trees. Inside the carriage, silence filled the space between them like unspoken truth. He sat across from her, hands gloved, posture straight. But his eyes, when they met hers, carried a weight that neither money nor power could erase. When at last he spoke, his voice was softer. "You may think me cruel," he said, "but I bought you to save you, not to own you." Clara turned her face toward the window, her reflection faint in the rain-streaked glass. "Forgive me, my lord," she murmured, "but I do not yet know the difference." The rest of the journey passed in silence. Two souls bound by a contract neither fully understood, riding toward a destiny written in ink, shadow, and secrets. The carriage rolled for hours through a landscape that grew stranger the farther they travelled. Forests that whispered in foreign tongues, valleys wrapped in mist, and cliffs where the sea clawed at the rocks below. Clara sat quietly, her hands folded over her lap, listening to the rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves. Every sound, every turn of the wheel carried her farther from the world she knew, and deeper into the one she feared. Her companion said little. Lord Alaric, if that was truly his name, sat across from her, the dim morning light brushing across his sharp profile. His features were aristocratic, yet shadowed by fatigue, the kind that spoke not of sleepless nights, but of old wounds left unhealed. He stared out the window as though haunted by ghosts only he could see. Once, when the carriage hit a rut and lurched violently, Clara gasped and reached instinctively for balance. His gloved hand caught hers before she could fall. For an instant, the warmth of his grip startled her. Their eyes met, his full of restrained intensity, hers wide with confusion. And then he released her hand, as though it burned him. "Forgive me," he said curtly, turning away. "There is nothing to forgive," she murmured, but her voice trembled. Hours later, the trees thinned and the carriage climbed a long, winding path toward a great stone fortress perched upon the cliffs. It rose from the mist like a shadow of a kingdom long forgotten. Towers grey with age, banners faded to memory. When the gates opened with a groan, the horses snorted uneasy, as though even they sensed the secrets that lay within. "This is your new home," Lord Alaric said quietly, stepping out and offering his hand. She hesitated, then accepted. His hand was steady, strong. The air smelled of salt and rain. Servants hurried forward, dressed not in English livery, but in strange, foreign garments. They bowed deeply to Alaric, but did not speak. Their eyes lingered on Clara with curiosity, even pity. "Welcome to Caer Orenth," said an elderly woman who appeared to be the housekeeper. Her accent was thick, unfamiliar. "The master has prepared chambers for you, my lady." My lady? The title felt strange, like a borrowed crown. As they entered the hall, Clara's breath caught. The interior was magnificent, yet touched with melancholy, vast corridors lit by iron sconces, portraits draped in dust, windows that opened to a sea eternally raging below. Every corner whispered of grandeur that had faded into exile. She was led to her room, a space far larger than her own chamber at Winthorne Hall. Velvet drapes framed a tall window overlooking the cliffs. On a table near the bed lay a silver comb and a folded shawl, as though someone had placed them there long ago and never returned. Before leaving, the housekeeper paused. "Do not be afraid of him," she said softly. "He is a man of great sorrow, not of cruelty." When the door closed, Clara sank onto the bed. Her reflection stared back from the mirror, pale, weary, but not broken. She could not yet name the feeling that stirred within her. Fear, yes, but something else too. Curiosity. That night, as rain lashed against the windows, she wandered the halls. The castle was silent, except for the sigh of the sea. Then she heard it, faint, rhythmic, like footsteps pacing in the dark. Following the sound, she stopped outside a closed study door. Inside, Lord Alaric stood before a fire, his coat removed, sleeves rolled up. His hair, dark and slightly dishevelled, glowed in the firelight. He was staring at something, a portrait half shrouded by a velvet cloth. Clara caught a glimpse before he turned. The painting depicted a young man in royal uniform, a crown at his feet, a sword in his hand. The likeness was unmistakable. Her breath caught. He looked like Alaric. He turned sharply, sensing her presence. "You should not wander at night," he said, his tone a mix of surprise and restraint. "I could not sleep," she whispered. "The sea keeps me awake." He studied her for a long moment. Then, in a voice quieter than the storm, he said, "It does the same to me." Their eyes met, not as master and servant, not as husband and wife by contract, but as two souls bound by loneliness. In that flicker of silence, something fragile and dangerous began to stir between them. Days turned into a quiet rhythm of habit, not peace, but a fragile truce between two souls bound by circumstance. The mornings at Caer Orinth were pale and cold, sunlight often smothered by the sea's unending mist. Clara rose early, not because she was asked to, but because sleep rarely found her. Her chamber was beautiful, but it was a beauty meant for ghosts, untouched furniture, polished mirrors, and roses that never bloomed. Lord Alaric was a man of patterns. He ate little, spoke less, and disappeared for hours into the lower halls of the estate, where the walls were lined with locked doors. Once she heard the faint sound of steel against stone. Training, perhaps, or memory turned physical. When he returned from those unseen rooms, his gloves were always darkened with soot or blood. Yet even in his silence, there was an odd gentleness about him. When the servants brought her meals, they were dishes from her homeland, her favourite tea, her mother's honeyed bread. She knew he must have told them, though he never said a word of it. Once, when she crossed the courtyard after rain, she slipped on the cobblestones. He appeared almost instantly, catching her before she hit the ground. The moment lingered, his hand firm around her arm, their faces close enough that she could see the faint, silver scar at his temple. "You should be careful," he said softly. "The sea mist makes the stones treacherous." "And yet," she replied, her voice trembling, "you walk here every night." A shadow passed over his eyes. "Some falls cannot be avoided." Then he turned away. Each evening, Clara found herself wandering toward the old library, a cavernous room filled with dust and silence. There she discovered a pianoforte covered in a heavy cloth. One evening, after convincing herself that no one would hear, she uncovered it and pressed a single key. The note echoed through the room, sweet and lonely. She played softly, a tune she remembered from childhood. The door opened before she could stop. Lord Alaric stood in the doorway, the fire behind him casting his face in gold and shadow. "I didn't know anyone still played that," he said. "It was my mother's favourite," she murmured. "I used to play it when I was frightened." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stepped closer, his boots soundless against the floor. "In my country," he said quietly, "we play that melody for the dead." Her hands froze on the keys. "Then I should stop." "No." His voice was sharper than he intended. He exhaled, lowering it. "No." "Please, continue." She did. The melody floated through the hall, filling the emptiness with something human. He stood motionless beside her, as though afraid that one movement might shatter the spell. When she finished, silence reclaimed the room. "Who taught you to play?" he asked. "My mother," she said. "She said music could speak when words could not." He looked away, his jaw tight. "Then your mother was wise." The firelight caught the side of his face. the faint line of grief etched there. And in that moment, Clara realized that his silence wasn't born of arrogance. It was a shield. He wasn't heartless. He was hurting. Later, as she lay awake, she thought of how he had looked at her, not with desire, not even affection, but with something deeper, recognition, as if her loneliness mirrored his own. The next morning, she found a single rose placed on her windowsill. It was the first she'd seen bloom since arriving. Crimson, fragile, alive. No note, no signature, but she knew whose hand had placed it there. That evening, she saw him again in the courtyard. He didn't speak, neither did she. Yet as the wind tangled her hair and he reached out, briefly, carefully, to brush a strand from her face, the silence between them said more than words ever could. It was a silence not of fear, but of understanding. The kind that happens when two broken souls begin to see light in each other's shadows. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of Caer Orinth became a quiet companion to Clara's solitude. The sea roared endlessly beyond the cliffs, its voice fierce yet strangely soothing, a constant reminder that even fury had rhythm. The castle stood like an unyielding sentinel against the storm, its stones worn smooth by salt and time. It was both a prison and a sanctuary. Lord Alaric's presence was the same, formidable yet steady, unpredictable yet strangely comforting. She would glimpse him from time to time, in the stables before dawn, brushing his horse's mane with unexpected tenderness. In the courtyard, where he sparred with unseen opponents beneath the grey sky. Or in the chapel, kneeling alone before a cold altar, his lips moving in silent prayer. Clara began to notice things. Small, secret details that whispered of another life. His accent, though faint, was not English. His manner of dress, slightly out of fashion, spoke of nobility but from elsewhere. His servants, loyal yet nervous, addressed him not as lord but as highness when they thought she wasn't near. One afternoon she followed the sound of the sea to a terrace overlooking the cliffs. The wind tugged at her shawl as she leaned against the railing, her eyes tracing the endless horizon. She hadn't heard him approach, but she felt it, that quiet stillness that seemed to move with him. "You'll catch cold," he said softly. She turned. He stood a few steps away, his coat unbuttoned, the breeze playing with his dark hair. For the first time, he looked less like a lord and more like a man stripped bare by fate. "I've lived in colder places," she replied with a faint smile. A ghost of amusement crossed his face, or would these are the first she'd ever seen. "I don't doubt it," he said. She hesitated. "Forgive me, my lord, but this place, it doesn't feel like England." His eyes darkened. "It isn't." "Then where?" He turned toward the sea, his gaze distant. "A kingdom that no longer exists." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken sorrow. She wanted to ask more, but something in his expression stopped her. It wasn't secrecy, it was grief. That evening, as she dined alone, she found a folded parchment beneath her plate. No signature, only a single line written in an unfamiliar hand. Trust him, even when he cannot trust himself. The handwriting was elegant, royal. Sleep would not come. The castle's corridors, once forbidding, now called to her. She followed the faint light of candles to the eastern wing, where portraits hung covered in dust and shadow. One in particular drew her. A tall, proud woman draped in crimson, her crown wrought of gold and pearls. Her eyes were the same colour as Alaric's. Before she could look closer, a voice echoed from the dark. "You shouldn't be here." Clara turned, startled. Alaric stood in the doorway, a lantern casting firelight across his face. His tone was calm, but his eyes were stormed with emotion. "I was only walking," she said softly. "I didn't mean to intrude." He stepped closer, lowering the lantern. "You've already seen too much." Her pulse quickened. "Then tell me the truth. Who are you?" For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a sigh that sounded centuries old, he reached up and uncovered the portrait. The lantern's glow caught the golden crown. "My mother," he said quietly. "Queen Isolde of Orenthia." Clara's breath caught. The name was legend, a fallen kingdom across the sea, overthrown in a bloody rebellion years ago. She had heard whispers as a child of a prince lost to exile, hunted by his enemies, never seen again. She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Then you—" "Yes," he said. "I was her son. Once." The silence that followed was deeper than fear. It was awe. "I bought you," he said finally, his tone low, pained, "because the men who ruined your father would have sold you to those who still hunt me. They wanted leverage. I gave them gold instead." Her throat tightened. "You risked yourself for a stranger." He looked at her then, truly looked, as though trying to see something beyond the surface. "Not for a stranger," he said quietly. "For someone who deserved better than to be sold." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows like the voice of the sea itself. And for the first time since she arrived, Clara did not feel like a prisoner. She felt chosen. But somewhere deep in the castle, a bell tolled, 3 low chimes that echoed like a warning. And though she could not yet name it, Clara felt the first tremor of danger stirring within the walls of Caer Orenth. From that night onward, something in the rhythm of Caer Orenth changed. The air still smelled of salt and storm, but the coldness that had clung to the corridors began to soften, as though the walls themselves had started to listen again. Clara, once wary of every shadow, began to walk the halls without fear. The servants' eyes followed, her less with suspicion and more with quiet approval. And when she crossed paths with Alaric, his silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like restraint, the careful holding back of someone afraid that one unguarded word might betray too much. He had given her space, freedom, luxuries no man who owned a wife by contract would ever grant. And yet he watched her, always at a distance, when she sat in the library reading by the fire, when she brushed her hair by the window at dusk, or when she tended to the small rose garden she'd coaxed back to life. One afternoon, she was pruning a branch when the thorn slipped beneath her skin, a sharp sting, then a bead of crimson. Before she could react, Alaric appeared beside her, his usual composure broken by concern. "You're bleeding," he said, kneeling to take her hand. "It's nothing," she replied softly, embarrassed by the closeness. "Just a scratch." He ignored her protest, pulling a linen cloth from his coat pocket and pressing it against her finger. His touch was careful. Too careful, as though he were afraid she might shatter beneath it. "You shouldn't tend roses without gloves," he murmured. "I didn't think I'd find any growing here," she said. And yet they bloomed. He looked at her then, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a fragile warmth that neither dared name. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't bleed for a life you didn't choose." The words struck her deeper than any wound. She wanted to ask what life he had bled for, what choices had carved the sorrow into his eyes, but the question stayed behind her lips. He rose and stepped back, but she noticed his hands trembled slightly before he tucked them behind his back. After that, small gestures began to appear. A book left at her bedside with a pressed flower between its pages. A cloak draped over her shoulders on windy nights. A melody hummed faintly down the corridor. One she realized was the same she had played on the pianoforte. Sometimes, when she passed the servants, she caught them exchanging knowing glances. Once, she overheard the housekeeper whisper, "The master smiles again." It was true. He did smile, not often and never fully, but enough to soften the sharp edges of his face. One night, as the rain drummed against the windows, she found him standing by the grand fireplace in the library. The firelight threw gold into his dark hair and softened the scar along his jaw. "You should rest," she said gently. "You've been awake since dawn." "I cannot sleep," he replied, eyes fixed on the flames. "I dream of a place that no longer exists." She stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady. "Then let this place be your peace." He turned to her, startled, almost undone by the sincerity in her tone. "You think such peace still exists for men like me?" "I think," she said, meeting his gaze, "that it finds those who least believe they deserve it." He didn't answer, but something flickered in his eyes, a spark long buried under years of guilt and exile. For the first time, he allowed himself to breathe in her presence, not as a ruler or a stranger, but as a man. When she finally turned to leave, he spoke, a single word that caught her mid-step. "Clara." She looked back. "Thank you," he said quietly. It was the first time he had spoken her name. And though no promise passed between them, the world seemed to shift, as though fate itself had begun to change its course, drawn by something neither of them could yet understand. The castle slept beneath the heavy hush of storm clouds. Rain beat against the windows, like the heartbeat of something wild and restless. Clara lay awake in her chamber, the candle beside her, long since melted to wax. The night felt thick with questions she could no longer silence, about Alaric, his past, and the strange air of sorrow that clung to Caer Orinth like ivy. Sleep would not come, so she rose and wrapped herself in a shawl. The corridor was dim, lit only by the glow of the hearth below. A strange light flickered from beneath a door at the end of the hall, a door she had seen him enter many times, but never leave unlocked. Curiosity overpowered caution. She turned the handle. Inside, the room was filled with shadows and memory. Maps stretched across the walls, inked with borders she didn't recognize, cities with names that sounded like song: Orenthia, Solmar, Valais. On the table sat a sword wrapped in cloth, its hilt engraved with the crest of a phoenix rising from fire. Papers and letters littered the surface, some sealed with crimson wax, others marked with a royal insignia. At the center of it all stood a portrait. It was him, Alaric, but not the man she knew. He was younger, his expression proud, wearing a uniform of deep blue trimmed with gold. Around his neck hung a medallion shaped like a crown. Clara's breath caught. Before she could move, a voice spoke from behind her. "You shouldn't be here." She turned. Alaric stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat, his expression unreadable. He looked tired, not angry, but defeated, as though he had known this moment would come. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly. "I heard the storm." "And followed it into my past," he interrupted gently. He stepped forward, his gaze flicking toward the portrait. "Now you see me for what I am." "A prince," she whispered, "in exile." He exhaled, as though the truth itself were a burden he had carried for too long. Prince Alaric of Orenthia, the last of a line that was never meant to end this way. Clara felt her pulse quicken. What happened? He turned toward the fire, his voice low, measured, the tone of a man telling a story that still bled. 5 years ago my mother was queen. My brother and I were heirs. 2 sons meant to rebuild a kingdom fractured by greed. But power is a disease that infects even the best of blood. My brother wanted the crown for himself. When the rebellion came, he stood on the wrong side of it. My mother died defending the palace gates. I escaped through fire and smoke with nothing but a sword and a name that could no longer protect me. The words hung heavy in the air. And your brother? Clara asked quietly. He met her gaze, his expression hollow. He rules what remains, a throne built on betrayal. She felt her throat tighten. And you hid here, across the sea. Exile was safer than revenge, he said, until your father's debt found its way to my table. My father's debt, she murmured, realization dawning. You bought me to save me from them. Alaric nodded once. The same men who ruined him now serve my brother. They would have sold you as leverage, a pawn to draw me out. I paid them before they could understand what they had offered. Clara pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed. You risked everything for me. He smiled faintly, sad, resigned. I've already lost everything, Clara. But saving you, that at least felt right. The firelight flickered across his face, illuminating the raw honesty in his eyes. For the first time, she saw not the prince, nor the exile, but the man, burdened, broken, yet noble still. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. And what now? Will you keep running? He looked at her for a long, quiet moment, then reached for the medallion on the table, the crest of his fallen house. No, I will rebuild, not for vengeance, but for peace. And me? She asked. He hesitated, then brushed a strand of her auburn hair from her cheek. His fingers lingered just long enough for her heart to stutter. You, he said softly, are free to go whenever you wish. You, he said softly, are free to go whenever you wish. The words echoed in the firelit silence, gentle and final, like the closing of a door. Yet, strangely, Clara did not feel free. She felt anchored. Something inside her stirred, not fear, not gratitude, but an ache she couldn't name. She lowered her gaze, her fingers tracing the hem of her sleeve. Is that what you truly wish, my lord, for me to leave? Alaric's jaw tightened. What I wish no longer matters. Wishes are for men who still have kingdoms. You still have one, she said softly. You just haven't seen it yet. He turned toward her, surprise flickering across his face. And where would that be? She stepped closer, her voice trembling, but sure. Here, she whispered, pressing her hand lightly against his chest. Whatever beats beneath this. The silence between them deepened, heavy with something that had been waiting too long to be spoken. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then he turned away sharply as though afraid that looking at her any longer might undo him completely. Clara, he said quietly, you do not understand what you risk. My life is a curse. Those who love me suffer for it. Then let me decide what I am willing to suffer for, she answered simply. He stared at her then, truly stared, as if her defiance was both maddening and holy. Something fragile cracked within him. From that night on, they were no longer strangers in the same house. He began to speak more freely. Small pieces of himself offered like gifts. Stories of his mother's laughter, of the music that once filled his palace gardens, of the sea that looked bluer in Orenthia than anywhere else. And in return, Clara told him of her childhood, of singing by the hearth with her mother, of the day her father sold their last horse, of the nights she prayed for a life she would not have to fear. He listened, truly listened, as though her every word had the power to heal him. Some evenings they sat together in the library, saying little, simply sharing the same air. He would read aloud from old Orenthian poetry, his voice deep and calm, while she watched the firelight dance over his face. There was comfort in the quiet, an unspoken understanding that neither of them needed to fill the silence anymore. Once, when she laughed, it's a bright, clear sound, he looked at her with startled wonder, as if he had forgotten what laughter even sounded like. "You have a gift," he said. "For what?" "For reminding the dead how to live." And though she tried to reply, her throat closed around the words. The castle itself seemed to come alive with their bond. Servants began to hum as they worked. The hearths burned longer into the night. Even the sea outside seemed calmer, its endless crashing now rhythmic, almost protective. Yet for every moment of warmth there was a shadow that followed. Alaric would sometimes fall silent mid-conversation, his gaze distant, haunted by ghosts she could not see. Once she found him in the chapel, staring at the stained glass window, depicting a phoenix rising from fire, his family's crest. "They say a phoenix is reborn from ashes," she said softly, joining him. He didn't turn. "Then I have burned too long to rise again." "Maybe," she said, touching the window pane. "You just haven't found what's worth rising for." He looked at her then, and for the first time, he didn't look away. In the days that followed, she began to wear her hair differently, not because he asked, but because of how he looked at her when she did. He began to walk the gardens again, not alone, but with her arm gently resting against his. And though neither dared call it love, every glance, every accidental touch, every breath shared in quiet rooms, said what words could not. Two souls, once sold and shattered, had begun to build something far rarer than kingdoms: belonging. Spring had finally come to Caer Orenth. The sea was gentler now, the air scented faintly with salt and blooming heather. For the first time in years, the castle no longer felt like a tomb. Servants smiled when passing their master, and laughter, once unthinkable, could be heard echoing down the stone corridors. Clara spent her mornings tending to the roses by the terrace, her skirts brushing against the damp stone, while Alaric often joined her, a cup of tea in hand, and a softness in his eyes he no longer tried to hide. "Orenthia had gardens like this once," he told her one morning. "The palace was built beside the river Solmar. My mother used to say the scent of roses there was sweeter than wine." Clara smiled, looking up from the blooms. "Then one day we'll plant them again, in your homeland." His gaze darkened. "My homeland no longer wants its prince." "Then we will give them their king," she whispered. The words startled him, not for their ambition, but for their faith. He said nothing, but she saw the thought take root in his silence. It was that same afternoon when the letter arrived. A messenger, hooded, soaked with rain, rode through the gates and handed Alaric a sealed envelope. The wax bore a crest Clara had never seen before, a black serpent coiled around a crown. Alaric's expression changed as he read. The blood drained from his face. He crushed the letter in his hand and strode into his study without a word. Clara followed, heart pounding. "What is it?" He turned to her, the letter trembling in his grip. "My brother is dead." She blinked, unable to comprehend. "Dead?" "Murdered," he said. "By his own men. The rebellion that kept me in exile has devoured itself. The throne of Orenthia is empty." For a moment, the words hung between them, both terrible and divine. Then you can return, she said, breathless. He shook his head. Return to what? A country poisoned by betrayal? A people who think me a coward for surviving? You can rebuild, she urged. You can lead them again, not as the man who fled, but as the man who endured. But he turned away, pacing like a caged lion. If I go back, I put you in danger. My enemies still breathe, and they will use whatever I love to destroy me. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. You speak as if I am a weakness. He froze, his eyes flicking to hers, anguish and love warring inside him. You are my only strength, and that is why you must be hidden from them. No, she said, shaking her head. I will not be hidden again. I have lived my life in shadows, sold and silenced, not anymore. Clara, if you go, she whispered, tears filling her eyes, then I go with you. The storm outside broke like glass. Rain lashed the windows, thunder roaring across the cliffs. He crossed the distance between them in a heartbeat, his hand catching hers, holding it to his chest. His heartbeat was wild, desperate. If I lose you, he said, voice raw, there will be nothing left worth reclaiming. Then don't lose me, she whispered. The next morning, before dawn, Alaric summoned his most trusted guards. She leaves tonight, he ordered quietly. Take her north, to the monastery by the river. She'll be safe there. When Clara learned of it, she refused to go. But by the time she reached the stables, the carriages were gone. He had sent her away. Not out of cruelty, but love. A love that feared the world would destroy it before it could bloom. From the window of her carriage, she watched the cliffs of Caer Orinth fade into mist. The wind howled like grief itself. And though she didn't know it yet, beyond those same cliffs, a war for the soul of Orinthia had already begun. One that would either crown a king reborn, or bury a prince forever. The days that followed were heavy with silence. At the monastery near the river, Clara sat by her window each evening, watching the candles flicker in the chapel below. The nuns spoke gently to her, but their kindness could not quiet the storm in her heart. Alaric had promised to return for her once it was safe, but weeks had passed, and no messenger had come. Rumours reached even that quiet place. Orinthia was in chaos. The Duke's exiled army had crossed the border. Cities were falling, banners burning. The serpent crest and the symbol of Alaric's house had been seen once more above the castle gates. Clara clutched the small pendant he had left her, his mother's sigil, and prayed every night. "Bring him back to me. Let him live." But one dawn a rider came bearing blood on his cloak. He asked for her by name. "Lady Clara Hart," he said softly, bowing his head. "His Grace bids me bring this to you." Her hands trembled as she accepted the sealed parchment. The wax was cracked from travel. When she opened it, a single line was written in Alaric's hand. "If I do not return by the next moon, remember that love itself is the crown I could never claim." The ink was smudged, perhaps by rain, perhaps by tears. Clara rose that night with fire in her chest. She packed a simple satchel and took a cloak from the abbess's chamber. No one saw her leave. The road to Orinthia was wild and broken, littered with ash and the scent of smoke. For 3 days she travelled alone. Once she came across a wagon of wounded soldiers, young boys who looked barely old enough to hold swords. They told her that the prince had led his army through the capital, that he had been wounded defending the bridge at Solmar Pass. "Dead?" she asked, her voice trembling. One soldier shook his head weakly. "No one knows, but they say he was last seen standing, even as the flames fell." That was all she needed to hear. By the time she reached the pass, the rain had turned to sleet. The battlefield stretched before her, a sea of broken standards and fallen men. Her boots sank into the mud, her skirts heavy with frost. And there, among the wreckage of the banners, she saw him. Alaric was slumped against the ruins of a carriage, blood seeping through the linen at his side. His sword lay beside him, its edge dulled, his hand still curled around the hilt. "Alaric!" she cried, falling to her knees beside him. His eyes fluttered open, weary, disbelieving. "Clara!" "You fool," she whispered, pressing her hands against his wound. "You promised me a future." He smiled faintly, even as pain shadowed his face. "You found me anyway. I always will." When the soldiers found them, hours later, she refused to leave his side. The men carried him back to what remained of his camp, and Clara stayed through the night, tending to him with trembling hands. Every time he stirred, he asked only one question. "Did they take the city?" "No," she said, brushing his hair from his brow. "You still have a kingdom waiting." He laughed weakly. "Then it's a broken kingdom, but it's ours." The dawn that followed painted the sky with pale gold. From the hills, the banners of the serpent and crown rose once again. Alaric's army, small, battered but loyal, had triumphed. And as the men gathered around their prince, he turned to the woman beside him, her hands still stained with his blood, her hair undone by the wind. Before them all, he took her hand and said, "You were sold once as a servant, but today, before the eyes of all my men, you are my queen." The crowd fell silent, then erupted in cheers that rolled across the valley like thunder. Clara's tears fell freely, glimmering like jewels in the morning sun. For the first time in her life, she was not something to be bought or given. She was chosen. Months passed, and the snows melted from the mountains of Orenthia. Where once fire and ruin scarred the land, new life began to bloom. The capital, once shrouded in smoke, now echoed with the sound of hammer and chisel as masons rebuilt the palace walls. Farmers returned to their fields, children to their laughter. And through it all, the people whispered of their new ruler, the exiled prince who returned from ashes, and the woman who brought him back to life. Clara walked through the palace gardens one morning, the scent of lilac heavy in the air. Her gown was simple still, the color of dawn, her hair bound loosely behind her shoulders. The servants bowed as she passed, but she smiled and nodded to each, her humility unchanged. At the far end of the terrace, Alaric stood gazing toward the river. The same river where his family had once ruled, where his mother's roses had grown before the wars. The wind caught his cloak, the embroidered crest of his house gleaming faintly in the light. "Your Majesty," she teased softly, approaching him. "You look far too solemn for a man who has everything." He turned, and that same rare smile, the one she had first seen in the candlelight of the inn, curved his lips. "Everything?" She tilted her head, a spark of playfulness in her eyes. "A kingdom, peace, the love of your people. What more could a prince desire?" He stepped closer, his voice low. "Only the love of the woman who made me worthy of it." Her laughter caught in her throat because his words carried no courtly charm, only truth. "I thought I had lost you," she whispered. "And I thought I had nothing left to give," he replied, brushing his fingers along her scar, the one she once hid from the world. "But then I found you, and you taught me that love is not given to the perfect. It's what makes us whole." The palace bells rang then, calling them to the great hall. Today was the coronation, not only for him, but for her. Inside, hundreds gathered beneath vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that poured colored light upon the marble floor. Nobles and peasants alike stood together, their divisions dissolved in the moment. As Alaric knelt before the high priest, the ancient crown of Orenthia was placed upon his brow. The crowd erupted in cheers. "Long live the king!" Then he turned, and to everyone's astonishment, he took the second crown, smaller, silver, delicate, and held it, not above her head, but at her heart. "My queen," he said, voice resonant across the hall, "you need no crown to be worthy of this title. But let the world know what I already do, that Orenthia was saved not by a sword, but by your faith." Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks as the crown touched her hair. The room fell silent. Then, as if guided by some divine memory, she began to hum, softly, gently. The lullaby her mother once sang to her, the same one that had reached Alaric on that storm-torn night when their lives first crossed. The song rose through the rafters, filling the hall with something purer than ceremony, hope. When the last note faded, Alaric took her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You gave me back my throne," he whispered, "but more than that, you gave me my soul." "And you," she murmured, smiling through tears, "gave me the choice my father once stole." Outside, the crowd cheered their names as the sun broke through the clouds. The sea beyond the city shimmered gold. Later that night, long after the feasting and the music had ended, Alaric and Clara stood together on the balcony overlooking the kingdom they had rebuilt. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what might have happened if you had never come to that market? If my father had sold me to another?" He smiled faintly. "Then I would still be wandering the world, a prince without a purpose, never knowing the woman who taught me how to be human." She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. The stars shimmered above like scattered crowns, and for the first time in either of their lives, the silence between them was not empty. It was peace. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the wind, the echo of her lullaby drifted once more, not as a memory, but as a promise. Love is not what we find. It is what we become.